The ballroom in Colorado Springs glittered with lies, glasses clinking like they were toasting my execution. My sister's face glowed on a massive screen, hailed as a saint, while I stood in the shadows, my chest burning, my soul shredded. My father, a retired colonel, grabbed the mic and spat venom for all to hear. One daughter's a hero. The other? A pathetic failure who disgraced us all. Laughter sliced through me, each chuckle a dagger twisting in my heart. I clenched my fists, nails drawing blood, as their mocking eyes buried me alive. The pain was unbearable, a scream I couldn't release. Then, from the back, an old drill sergeant's voice thundered, "General? Ma'am?" The room froze. Their jaws dropped. I stood taller, unbroken. I'm Claire Bennett. I'm 30 years old. And that night, I vowed they'd pay for every tear I'd swallowed. That night in the Colorado Springs ballroom wasn't the first time my father's words cut me open. The pain was old, festering, carved into me years ago at the Air Force Academy, just 10 miles from that glittering hellhole of a party. I was 22, top of my class, eyes locked on a pilot's wings. My classmates called me Iron Claire, unbreakable, always first in drills, running 5 miles before dawn without breaking a sweat. But one night, during a live fire exercise, I saw it. 3 cadets, my friends, stumbling toward a mismarked zone, seconds from death. My commanding officer screamed to hold position. I didn't. I sprinted 50 feet, tackled them to the ground, bullets whizzing past. They lived. I thought I'd done right. I was wrong. The next morning, my CO, Major Hargrove, called me to his office. "You disobeyed a direct order, Bennett," he barked, his face red. "You made me look like a fool." I stood tall, heart pounding. "Sir, I saved 3 lives." He leaned closer, voice low. "And you'll pay for it." That night, a report hit my desk, rewritten, twisted. It said I'd panicked, endangered the team, lacked discipline. My name was smeared in black ink. I went to my father, Colonel Richard Bennett, thinking he'd fight for me. He didn't. He sat in his study, medals gleaming on the wall, and said, "Claire, you embarrassed the chain of command. Sign the withdrawal form. Take a year to rethink your priorities." His voice was ice, his eyes never meeting mine. I begged, "Dad, you know the truth." He stood, turned away. "The truth doesn't matter when you break rank." I signed the form, my hands shaking, my future crumbling. I packed my duffel, left the academy, and never looked back. My family buried me in silence. My mother sent a single text, "Don't upset your father." Sophie, my little sister, got her wings, her promotions, her spotlight. They thought I was drifting, maybe waitressing, maybe lost. They didn't know I'd clawed my way back, forged a new path in shadows they couldn't see. But that night, as my father's voice echoed failure across the ballroom, the old wound ripped open, raw and bleeding. I wasn't just Claire anymore. I was the daughter they'd erased, and I was done letting their lies define me. The chandeliers in the Colorado Springs ballroom cast a golden glow, but to me, it was a prison of polished lies, every sparkle a reminder of my erasure. I stood against the far wall, 20 feet from the main tables, my black dress ironed crisp but my heart a furnace of rage and grief. The room buzzed with 50 guests, family, friends, and Air Force brass, sipping wine and fawning over my sister, Sophie Bennett, whose face dominated a 10-foot screen. There she was, in her pressed uniform, saluting at her latest promotion ceremony, a shining second lieutenant. The crowd clapped like she'd won a war single-handedly. My father, Colonel Richard Bennett, retired but still commanding the room, stood at the podium, his silver hair catching the light, his voice booming with pride. I clutched my water glass, the ice long melted, my nails digging into my palm as I braced for what I knew was coming. "Sophie is our legacy," Richard declared, raising his glass. "She's proof of what discipline and honor can achieve." The room erupted in applause, forks clinking against plates. Then his eyes found me, cold and deliberate, like a sniper locking on. "Not everyone has that strength," he said, pausing for effect. Some falter. Some fail. Some drag the family name through the mud. A ripple of whispers spread. Heads turned, pinning me to the wall. My aunt, Linda, leaned to her neighbor and muttered, "He means Claire." Always a disappointment. I didn't flinch, but inside, my chest screamed, the old wound from the Air Force Academy splitting wide open. 8 years ago, I'd saved lives and lost everything. Now, I was a ghost in my own family, forced to stand here while they buried me again. I scanned the room for Sophie, hoping for a glance, a shred of acknowledgement. She sat at the head table, radiant in her dress blues, laughing with a major. She didn't look my way. Why would she? To her, I was the sister who'd crashed and burned, the cautionary tale whispered at family dinners. My mother, Ellen, hovered near the dessert table, avoiding my gaze, her pearls gleaming as she played the perfect hostess. "Claire, dear," she'd said earlier, her voice syrupy, "just stay out of the way tonight. It's Sophie's moment." I'd nodded, biting back the urge to scream. Now, as the crowd toasted Sophie's name, I was invisible, a stranger in a room of people who'd known me since I was born. I edged toward the exit, my heels silent on the carpet, the 30-foot walk feeling like a mile. The air was thick with perfume and hypocrisy, and I needed out before I shattered. But Richard wasn't done. He raised his voice, each word a hammer. "We celebrate those who rise above," he said, staring straight at me. "Not those who crumble under pressure." A guest chuckled. Another coughed. My throat burned, my vision blurring, but I kept my chin up, refusing to let them see me break. I was 3 steps from the door when a voice cut through the noise like a gunshot. "General? Ma'am?" The words echoed, sharp and certain. Every head snapped toward the back of the room. Sergeant Thomas Caldwell, 60 years old, grizzled and broad-shouldered, stood rigid, his eyes locked on me. His face was a mix of shock and recognition, his hand half-raised in a salute. The room fell silent, glasses frozen mid-air. Sophie's smile vanished. Richard's jaw tightened, his knuckles white on the podium. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her chest. I stood still, heart pounding, the weight of their stares crushing me. Caldwell's voice trembled, but he didn't back down. "Claire? Is that you?" he asked, softer now, like he was seeing a ghost. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind raced back to a classified operation 3 years ago, a late-night briefing where I'd crossed paths with him, my identity shielded under Nexus Initiative protocols. He shouldn't have recognized me. But he did. And now, the room was a powder keg, and I was the spark. "Who's she?" a guest whispered. "General," another hissed. Sophie stood, her chair scraping the floor, her eyes darting between me and Caldwell. Richard slammed his glass down, the crack echoing. "Enough," he barked, glaring at Caldwell. "You're mistaken, Sergeant. Sit down." But Caldwell didn't move. He looked at me, his eyes searching, and I saw something there, respect, maybe even regret. I wanted to run, to scream, to tear the screen down and show them who I really was. Instead, I straightened my spine, my voice low but steady. "Not tonight, Sergeant," I said, each word a blade. "Not here." I turned and walked out, the door swinging shut behind me, their whispers chasing me into the night. But I wasn't running. I was ready to fight. The night air outside the Colorado Springs ballroom hit me like a slap, cold and sharp, but it couldn't douse the fire raging in my chest. I stood in the parking lot, 100 feet from the glow of that cursed party, my breath visible in the 40-degree chill, my heart a war drum of fury and pain. My father's words, pathetic failure, echoed in my skull, each syllable a fresh cut on a scar 8 years old. The memory of Sergeant Thomas Caldwell's voice, "General? Ma'am," burned just as deep, not because it was kind, but because it threatened to unravel everything I'd buried. I wasn't the broken daughter they mocked. I was something else, something they'd never see coming. They thought I was nothing, scraping by in some dead-end job, maybe pouring coffee or filing papers in a cubicle. My mother, Ellen, had whispered it once at a family barbecue, "Claire's just lost." Sophie, my sister, never asked what I did, too busy polishing her medals. Colonel Richard Bennett, my father, didn't care enough to wonder. They were wrong. Dead wrong. I wasn't lost. I was forged in the shadows, sharpened by the betrayal that drove me from the Air Force Academy. 3 years ago, I joined the Nexus Initiative, a covert intelligence outfit operating in the gray zones of national security. No badges, no parades, just results. My work was silent, surgical, tracking data leaks, neutralizing threats, protecting systems the Pentagon didn't even admit existed. I wasn't a soldier anymore. I was a ghost, and I was damn good at it. I leaned against my car, the metal cold under my palms, and let my mind drift to that night 3 years back, in a nondescript warehouse 15 miles outside Denver. I was on a Nexus op, analyzing a server breach that traced to a contractor skimming classified tech. The briefing room was dim, just me, a laptop, and a stack of encrypted drives. Sergeant Thomas Caldwell was there, not as a drill instructor but as a consultant, his clearance barely high enough to sit in. I wore a plain jacket, my hair tied back, my face unreadable. My Nexus codename, Spectre, was all he knew me by. We didn't speak, but I caught him watching me, his eyes narrowing as I flagged a hidden encryption key in under 10 minutes. "Hell of a call, ma'am," he'd said, his voice gruff but respectful. I nodded, said nothing, and left. Nexus protocol demanded anonymity, but Caldwell's memory was sharper than I'd expected. That night in the ballroom, he'd seen through the disguise, through the years, and called me what no one else dared, a leader. I slid into my car, the leather seat creaking, and checked my phone. A Nexus alert blinked, Peterson AFB, observe comms, report anomalies, no contact. My lips curled into a bitter smile. Of course, it was Peterson, the base just 5 miles from this farce of a party. My family thought I was here to clap for Sophie's promotion, but I was working, always working, scanning their precious Air Force for cracks they'd never notice. Last month, I'd traced a phishing attempt to a server 2 miles from Peterson's gate, a low-level hack that could have spiraled into a breach. I shut it down in 48 hours, my report so clean it could have been framed. No one thanked me. No one knew. That was the job, and I loved it, not for glory, but for the control it gave me over a world that tried to break me. Back in the ballroom, they were still toasting Sophie, oblivious to the truth. I wasn't the failure they painted. I'd built a life they couldn't touch, a purpose they couldn't tarnish. But Caldwell's outburst had cracked the armor I'd worn for years. General, he'd called me, a title I'd never claimed but one Nexus whispered in their sealed briefings. It wasn't official, just a nod to the way I commanded ops, cool and unflinching. My pulse raced, not from pride, but from dread. If Caldwell recognized me, others might. My anonymity was my shield, and it was slipping. I started the car, the engine's hum drowning out the distant laughter from the ballroom. My hands gripped the wheel, knuckles white, as I thought of Richard's face when Caldwell spoke. His anger wasn't just embarrassment, it was fear. He knew I wasn't nothing, even if he'd never admit it. And Sophie, she'd looked at me for the first time in years, her eyes wide, questioning. I didn't owe them answers. I owed them nothing. But as I pulled onto the highway, the rage in my chest twisted into something sharper, resolve. They'd buried me once. They wouldn't get a second chance. I was Claire Bennett, and I was done hiding. The highway stretched dark and empty as I drove away from the Colorado Springs ballroom, the city lights fading into a blur 5 miles behind me. My hands gripped the steering wheel, the rage in my chest a living thing, clawing to escape. Sergeant Thomas Caldwell's words, "General? Ma'am?" had torn open a wound I'd spent years stitching shut, but it was my father's voice, Colonel Richard Bennett, calling me a failure that burned deepest. 8 years ago, he'd signed my exile from the Air Force Academy, and tonight, he'd buried me again in front of 50 strangers. But I wasn't the broken girl they thought. I was Claire Bennett, a Nexus Initiative operative, and I'd left a trap for the truth to find its way out. 2 weeks before the party, I'd slipped a training manual into Sophie's apartment, a leather-bound book labeled Tactical Leadership. She was my sister, 26 years old, a second lieutenant basking in our family's praise, but I knew she'd read it. Sophie was meticulous, always chasing perfection. Tucked inside the manual's back cover was a Nexus design data chip, no bigger than a credit card, its surface etched with a faint circuit pattern. It was a digital tripwire, coded to activate if anyone accessed its encrypted files without clearance. I didn't tell Sophie it was there. I didn't need to. Her curiosity, her need to outshine me, would do the rest. I'd waited, checking my Nexus device nightly, until tonight, as I pulled into my apartment complex 10 miles from Peterson Air Force Base, the screen lit up, unauthorized access detected. File, Academy Incident 2017. Signature, Richard Bennett, Code 819. My heart stopped. I parked under a flickering streetlight, the 40-degree air seeping through my car window as I opened the file. There it was, the original report from that night at the academy, the one I'd saved 3 cadets from a live-fire zone. It praised my decisive action under pressure. But another file, stamped the same week, told a different story. Cadet Claire Bennett exhibited reckless insubordination, endangering unit cohesion. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable, Colonel Richard Bennett, my father. He'd rewritten the truth, framed me as a failure to protect his buddy, Major Hargrove, whose sloppy orders nearly got those cadets killed. My hands shook, not from cold but from a fury so raw it felt like my bones would crack. I'd known he betrayed me, but seeing his name in black and white was a knife to the gut. My phone buzzed, snapping me out of the haze. Sophie's name flashed on the screen. I hesitated, then answered. Claire, she whispered, her voice trembling, what the hell is this? I could hear her pacing, probably in her tiny apartment 3 miles from the base. I found your book. There's a chip inside. It showed me files. Dad's signature. He lied about you. Her words broke, like she was choking on them. Sophie, I said, my voice steady but laced with ice, what did you see? She took a shaky breath. You saved those cadets. Dad said you screwed up, but he changed the report. He made you look like, she stopped, unable to say it. Like a failure, I finished, my tone flat. He did it to save his reputation. And you believed him. Claire, I didn't know. Sophie's voice cracked, raw with guilt. He told me you quit, that you couldn't handle the academy. Everyone did. I clenched my jaw, the pain of her words slicing deeper than my father's. You never asked, Sophie, I said, each word a controlled explosion. You were too busy being the golden child. She went silent, her breathing heavy. Why didn't you tell me, she finally asked, almost pleading. Because you wouldn't have listened, I shot back. You were his shadow, saluting his every word. I paused, softening just enough. But you're not him. Not yet. I heard a thud, like she dropped the manual. What do I do now? She asked, her voice small, like the little girl who used to follow me around our backyard. I leaned back in my seat, the weight of 8 years pressing down. You decide, I said. You can keep his lie or face the truth. But if you come for him, Sophie, you better be ready for what's on the other side. She didn't answer. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my pulse hammering, knowing I'd just lit a fuse. Sophie wasn't just my sister, she was a soldier, trained to question, to act. That chip wasn't just a key to my past, it was a mirror, forcing her to see the father she worshipped for who he really was. I didn't know if she'd fight or fold, but one thing was certain, the truth was out, and it was coming for Richard Bennett like a storm he couldn't outrun. The sterile conference room at Peterson Air Force Base, 5 miles from downtown Colorado Springs, felt like a tomb, its fluorescent lights buzzing 10 feet above a polished oak table. I sat ramrod straight, my hands folded, my black blazer pressed but my heart a furnace of rage so fierce it could have burned the walls down. Across from me, Sophie Bennett, my 26-year-old sister, gripped the edge of her chair, her second lieutenant's uniform crisp but her face pale, eyes flickering with a storm of guilt and fury. Between us, at the head of the table, sat our father, Colonel Richard Bennett, 58 years old, retired but still carrying the weight of his rank like a crown. His silver hair gleamed, his posture unbending, but his eyes, cold, calculating, betrayed a flicker of unease. This wasn't a family reunion. This was a reckoning, and the air crackled with the weight of 8 years of lies. 3 days after Sophie found the Nexus chip in my training manual, we'd filed a formal complaint through a secure channel, demanding an internal review of the 2017 Air Force Academy incident that ended my career. The panel, 3 officers in starched uniforms, sat across from us, their faces unreadable, tablets glowing with the files we'd submitted, the original report praising my actions in saving 3 cadets, and the falsified version, signed by Richard, branding me a reckless failure. My pulse hammered, not from nerves but from the bone-deep pain of facing the man who'd chosen his ego over his daughter. Sophie hadn't spoken to me since our phone call, but her presence here, risking her own career, said enough. She was ready to break the silence that had choked our family for years. The lead officer, a major with a clipped voice, cleared his throat. "Colonel Bennett, the evidence suggests you altered a 2017 training report, misrepresenting Cadet Claire Bennett's actions. Do you acknowledge your signature, Code 819, on the modified document?" Richard leaned back, his hands steepled, his face a mask of calm. "I do," he said, his voice smooth, like he was ordering coffee, not admitting to betrayal. My stomach churned, the room shrinking around his words. Sophie's breath hitched, her knuckles whitening. The major pressed on. "Were you directed to make this change, or was it your decision?" Richard's eyes flicked to me, then away, dismissing me in a heartbeat. "My decision," he said. "The original report would have undermined confidence in the Academy's leadership. I corrected the narrative to preserve operational integrity." "Corrected?" Sophie's voice sliced through the room, sharp and trembling. She stood, her chair scraping the floor, her eyes locked on Richard. "You lied, Dad. Claire saved 3 lives, and you threw her away to cover for Major Hargrove's mistake." The panel shifted, but Richard didn't flinch. He looked at Sophie like she was a cadet stepping out of line. "Sit down, Lieutenant," he said, his tone ice-cold. "You don't understand the stakes." Sophie's face flushed, but she didn't sit. "I understand plenty," she snapped. "You told me Claire quit, that she was weak. You let me believe it my whole life. Why?" Richard's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent, his refusal louder than any answer. I stood, my voice low but razor-sharp, cutting through the tension. "Because he needed a scapegoat," I said, my eyes burning into his. "You couldn't let Hargrove take the fall, so you made me the failure. You signed my name out of existence, Dad, and you didn't even blink." Richard met my gaze for the first time, his expression unyielding. "You disobeyed orders, Claire," he said, each word deliberate. "You embarrassed the chain of command." "I did what was necessary." My chest tightened, the pain so raw it stole my breath. 8 years of silence, of carrying his lie, and he still saw me as a flaw to be erased. "Necessary?" I echoed, my voice shaking with controlled fury. "You chose your reputation over your daughter. That's not leadership. That's cowardice." The major raised a hand, cutting us off. "We've reviewed the evidence," he said. "The original report will be reinstated. Colonel Bennett, your advisory role is terminated, effective immediately. Cadet Bennett's record will be cleared." Richard nodded once, his face blank, as if he'd just been told the weather. No apology, no regret. Sophie sank into her chair, her hands covering her face, a sob catching in her throat. I stayed standing, my nails digging into my palms, the victory hollow against the ache of his indifference. The panel dismissed us, but as we filed out, Sophie grabbed my arm, her voice a whisper. "He didn't even care, Claire. How could he not care?" I looked at her, my sister, broken by the truth I'd carried alone for years. "Because he never did," I said, my voice cracking. Not about me. Not about us. The door closed behind us, but the war wasn't over. Richard's lies had cost me everything, and now, they were tearing Sophie apart too. The parking lot outside Peterson Air Force Base was a sea of asphalt under a gray Colorado spring sky, the 45-degree chill biting through my blazer as I stood 20 feet from the base's main gate. The internal review had ended an hour ago, stripping Colonel Richard Bennett of his advisory role and clearing my name after 8 years of lies. But the victory felt like ash in my mouth, the weight of my father's cold indifference heavier than any verdict. Sophie Bennett, my 26-year-old sister, had stood beside me in that sterile conference room, her second lieutenant's uniform no shield against the truth we'd uncovered. Richard, our father, had rewritten my academy record to save his own skin. Now, as I waited by my car, the engine still warm from the 5-mile drive from the hearing, Sophie emerged from the base, her face pale, her steps uneven. She'd asked to speak to Richard alone. I didn't stop her. I knew she needed to face the man who'd raised us to worship his shadow. Sophie stopped 10 feet away, her breath visible in the cold, her eyes red but dry, like she'd fought back tears and lost. "He doesn't care, Claire," she whispered, her voice cracking like thin ice. I asked him why. I begged him to explain. I stayed silent, my hands shoved deep in my pockets, my heart a raw, pulsing wound. I'd carried Richard's betrayal for years, but seeing it shatter Sophie was a pain so deep it felt like drowning. "What did he say?" I asked, my voice low, steady, hiding the storm inside. Sophie's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. "He said you deserved it," she spat, her words trembling with rage. "He said you were disloyal, a liability, that you had to be cut loose to protect the Academy's standards." I froze, the words hitting like a sledgehammer. 8 years ago, Richard had called me a failure to my face, but this was worse. He'd erased me, not just from his legacy but from his heart, and now he was justifying it like I was nothing more than a clerical error. "He said more," Sophie continued, her voice breaking. "He looked me in the eye and said, 'If you keep digging, Sophie, you'll end up like her, out in the cold, forgotten.' He didn't even blink, Claire. He threatened me, his own daughter, to keep me in line." Her eyes met mine, wide with disbelief, the golden child finally seeing the monster behind the medals. My chest tightened, the pain so sharp it felt like my ribs were cracking. I wanted to scream, to tear down the base's concrete walls, but I stood still, my face unreadable, my fury locked tight. "Sophie," I said, my voice a controlled burn, "he's always been this way. You just didn't see it." She shook her head, stepping closer, her boots scuffing the asphalt. "I idolized him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every promotion, every salute, I did it for him. And now," she trailed off, a tear escaping down her cheek. "Now I see what he did to you. How could he choose his pride over us?" I swallowed hard, the memory of my 22-year-old self signing that withdrawal form flashing in my mind. "Because that's who he is," I said, each word a blade. "He loves his legacy more than his daughter's. Always has." Sophie sank onto the curb, her uniform creased, her hands covering her face. "I feel like I don't know him," she said, her voice muffled. "Or myself." I knelt beside her, 3 feet away, close enough to feel her pain but far enough to keep my own from spilling over. "You're not him," I said, my tone firm but soft. "You never were. That's why you're here, Sophie. You chose the truth." She looked up, her eyes searching mine, raw and desperate. "But it hurts so much," she whispered. "Knowing he'd throw me away too." I nodded, my throat burning. "It does. And it will. But you're stronger than his lies." I stood, offering her my hand. She took it, her grip trembling but fierce, like she was clinging to something real for the first time. The base loomed behind us, its chain-link fence glinting in the fading light, a symbol of the world Richard had built, a world that had no place for us unless we bowed to his rules. I'd walked away from it years ago, forged my own path with Nexus, but Sophie was just beginning to see the cost of her loyalty. As we stood there, the wind whipping through the lot, I knew this wasn't the end. Richard's words had cut us both, but they'd also bound us together. The pain was unbearable, but it was fuel. We weren't done fighting, not for him, but for ourselves. The Colorado Springs dusk settled over the city, painting the sky a bruised purple as I stood outside my apartment, 8 miles from Peterson Air Force Base. The weight of the past week, the ballroom humiliation, the Nexus chip, the review that stripped Colonel Richard Bennett of his legacy, pressed against my chest, but it wasn't rage anymore. It was something quieter, heavier, like the calm after a storm you've survived but will never forget. My sister, Sophie Bennett, stood beside me, her second lieutenant's uniform replaced with a plain gray jacket, her shoulders squared but her eyes carrying the ghosts of our father's betrayal. Richard's words in that parking lot, calling me a liability and warning Sophie she'd end up the same, had shattered something in her. But in that brokenness, I saw strength, hers, mine, ours. 2 days after the review, Sophie showed up at my door, her face set, her hands empty except for a small velvet box. She opened it, revealing her Air Force rank insignia, the silver bars glinting under my porch light. "I'm done wearing this," she said, her voice steady but raw, like she'd clawed it out of her throat. "It's his dream, not mine." I nodded, my heart aching but proud. "What's next?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe, my voice softer than it had been in years. Sophie's lips trembled, but she held my gaze. "I requested a transfer to civilian oversight, Nexus Initiative, like you. I want to fix things, Claire, not salute lies." I didn't smile, but something in me lifted, like a weight I'd carried for 8 years had finally shifted. We walked inside, the 600-square-foot apartment sparse but mine, a sanctuary of white walls and silence. Sophie sat on the couch, her fingers tracing the box's edges. "I thought this badge meant everything," she said, almost to herself. "It was supposed to make me someone." I sat across from her, 5 feet away, my hands still, my voice calm but firm. "You are someone, Sophie. Not because of a badge or his approval. Because you chose to see the truth." She looked up, her eyes wet but fierce. "You carried this alone for so long," she said. "Why didn't you hate me?" I swallowed, the question cutting deeper than I expected. "Because you're my sister," I said. "And I knew you'd find your way." The next morning, Sophie started at Nexus, shadowing my team on a low-level data audit, her focus sharp, her questions precise. She wasn't the golden child anymore, she was rebuilding, redefining herself. I watched her from across the office, 10 feet away, and felt a quiet pride, not for what she'd achieve, but for what she'd chosen to leave behind. Before I left for my next assignment, I slipped a note into her bag, written on plain paper, "To Dula Chan Chin Min. Freedom is choosing yourself." I didn't sign it. She'd know. As I drove out of Colorado Springs, the Rockies fading in my rearview mirror, I thought about the girl I was at 22, signing away her future under Richard's cold gaze. I wasn't that girl anymore. I was Claire Bennett, 30 years old, a Nexus operative who'd turned pain into purpose. The lesson wasn't in the victory over my father, it was in the choice to keep going, to build something true, even when the world calls you a failure. To anyone listening, don't let someone else's lies define your worth. You're not their story. You're yours. Write it with courage, even if it hurts. The Colorado Springs skyline faded behind me as I drove into the night, the Rockies a dark silhouette 10 miles in the distance, my heart still raw from the war I'd fought and won. Colonel Richard Bennett's lies, exposed after 8 years, had cost him his legacy, but the scars he left on me, Claire Bennett, and my sister, Sophie Bennett, would linger longer. Sophie, now 26, had torn off her Air Force badge, choosing truth over our father's shadow, joining me at Nexus Initiative to build something real. That choice wasn't just hers, it's yours too. If you've ever been called a failure, if someone's words have tried to bury your worth, I see you. I know that pain, the kind that burns so deep you think it'll break you. But it doesn't have to. You're stronger than their lies, I told Sophie, and I'm telling you now. Your story matters. Drop it in the comments below. Tell me who tried to dim your light and how you rose above it. Hit that subscribe button if you're ready for more stories of real people, like me and Sophie, clawing their way out of betrayal to claim their truth. Next week, we're diving into another fight, one where a single choice turned pain into power. Don't miss it. Because when the world says you're nothing, you get to prove it wrong.